Hi theory students. Today we'll be starting our study of counterpoint with something that we call first species. In this first part, I'm going to define the goals of our counterpoint study and some of the basic terms. What is species counterpoint? It's a study of how two or more independent melodic lines fit together. We are now entering a realm of not just unchanging rules and formulas, but also guidelines which are expressed as preferences, not absolutes. What I mean by this is that when we studied fundamentals, we used formulas and rules so that, for example, the order of the sharps in a key signature were always F, C, G, D, etc. The key signature for D major was always 2 sharps. The key signature for F sharp minor was always 3 sharps. And once we learn what the formula is for computing this, there's just one correct answer. That's what I mean by unchanging rules and formulas. Now, if we're doing something as a preference, not an absolute, that means that we want to do something most of the time, but not 100% of the time. And this is necessary to give music its variety. For example, you may have a favorite food, like a mushroom pizza, for example, but even though that's your favorite food, you wouldn't eat it every single night, or you'd very soon get sick of it. So we can have a preference, but we need to have a variety of things that we use, not just our preference 100% of the time, so that every piece of music can be unique and they're not just carbon copies of each other. So here are the goals for every melodic line. The lines should open and end on the tonic. Sorry about that. To give a strong sense of key. The approach to the final tonic should be by step. The lines should have a good contour, one unique or at most 2 high points. The line should have a good flow, and it should have several changes of direction. We prefer stepwise, which we call conjunct motion, over skips or leaps. A skip is defined as a move by a third. Think of it as skipping from one note of a chord to another. Or a leap, moving by a fourth or more. These skips or leaps we sometimes call disjunct motion. Anything that's larger than a step needs to be consonant. We define that by major thirds or minor thirds, perfect fourths or perfect fifths, minor sixths or major sixths, and a perfect octave. Just as with the other discussion of intervals, thirds and sixths are imperfect consonances, fourths, fifths, and octaves are perfect consonances. In the minor mode, we raise scale degree 7 right before the final tonic in order to create a leading tone. So at the outset, let's just clarify something about our counterpoint study. We all know many, many good melodies that don't all fit these conditions. So you're wondering what are these rules and guidelines all about? The study of counterpoint is hundreds and hundreds of years old, and the idea here is to use this as a laboratory to study things under a very controlled condition, and we will factor in or allow more and more freedom as we go. But first we want to start with the most controlled conditions. So while you may know melodies that don't fit these rules and guidelines, we'll start with the most restrictive thing and then we'll relax them later. Here are some terms. The Cantus Firmus, which is Latin for fixed voice, we can abbreviate this sometimes as either CF or just Cantus. This is a given melodic line which is not altered as we write our counterpoint lines. We can write our own Cantus Firmus, but for now it's best to use the ones that counterpoint teachers through the ages have given to us, because we know they've been tried and tested and work very well. The counterpoint line is a melodic line that's going to be written against or at the same time as the cantus, and it must meet certain conditions. Here are some of the rules and guidelines for first species. When we write our counterpoint line, we're going to be using all whole notes. One note in the counterpoint for each note in the cantus. The goal is to write a counterpoint line that is itself a good melodic line, as we defined previously, and fits with the cantus. What we mean by fits, we'll see as we go along. The intervals between the cantus and the counterpoint must all be consonant. So it's a perfect unison, which we can use at the beginning and the end, but we prefer not to use those in the middle. Minor thirds and major thirds, perfect fifths, interestingly, not perfect fourths if we're talking about a harmonic interval, not a melodic one, minor sixths, major sixths, and a perfect octave. We can also use the compound intervals, for instance, not just minor thirds and major thirds, but we can use minor tenths and major tenths, not just a perfect fifth, but a perfect twelfth as well. The counterpoint line also begins and ends on the tonic. Let's look at a few Cantus Firmus lines to see how they're constructed. The first Cantus Firmus line is in the minor mode, in this case D minor. Notice that it's mostly stepwise motion. There are the steps. It has one leap at the beginning and one skip somewhere in the middle. Having no more than one leap is a pretty good policy. If you have more than one leap, they're generally better earlier in the line, and if the leaps aren't too large. So this is a well-constructed line. Notice that it changes directions here, it changes directions again there, and then here going to the close. It ends on the tonic, D, and approaches it by step, E. Now let's look at one in a major mode. This is mostly stepwise motion. There's one skip here, there's one skip there, and no leaps at all. We begin and end on the tonic C and approach the last tonic with a D. Note the changes of direction here. It goes up to a unique high point A and then changes direction going to the final note. There's no motion in any direction for too long. For a line that has 11 notes total, 5 in a row at the end is about the maximum. The numbering of these lines, Cantus Firmus 2, Cantus Firmus 3, this comes from a list of 7 classic Cantus Firmus lines that are in your workbook at the beginning of Chapter 9. Now I'm going to show you how a counterpoint line might fit together with a Cantus Firmus line. This is Cantus Firmus number 2 that we just showed you in D minor. And I'm going to write it an octave lower in bass clef so that I have room to fit a counterpoint line in treble clef above it. So here's how they sound together. We already heard the cantus by itself, the counterpoint line sounds like this. Notice that it's mostly stepwise motion, several changes of direction, and the flow and the variety of motion is good. At the very end, where I'm ending the line, I use a leading tone C sharp, which is not in the key signature, to make a nice conclusive ending on the tonic. The melodic intervals are all good. The harmonic intervals, octave, thirds, sixth, octave, a tenth, that's an octave plus a third, a couple of sixths, and then an octave at the end. Note that I don't need to write major or minor third, major or minor sixth. If we're within the key, in this case D minor, the key takes care of whether the thirds or sixths are major or minor, but we're not going to have any augmented or diminished thirds if we follow the key signatures. So there's a good variety of harmonic intervals. There's a good melodic motion here, and a good fit with the Cantus Firmus. In the next video, we'll go into a little more detail about these rules and guidelines. There's a little more to it than what we went over in this one, but let's at least digest this much. That's all for today.